A photograph sits in an archive, catalogued, indexed, forgotten. The year is 1915. 5 faces stare back through time. A father, a mother, 3 children arranged in perfect symmetry. The studio backdrop suggests prosperity. The clothing speaks of middle-class respectability. The expressions reveal nothing unusual. For decades, this image remained exactly what it appeared to be, an ordinary family portrait from early 20th century America. Then someone looked closer. The discovery happened on a Tuesday afternoon in March 2019, when Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a curator at the Historical Society of Philadelphia, began digitizing a collection of uncatalogued photographs donated by a local estate. The process was routine, mechanical even. Scan the image, adjust the resolution, tag the metadata, move to the next item. She had processed hundreds of similar portraits that week alone. Women in high-collared dresses, men with starched collars and serious expressions. Children posed like miniature adults, instructed to remain perfectly still for the camera's long exposure. This particular photograph bore the embossed mark of Hartwell & Sons Photography Studio in the bottom right corner, a respected establishment that had operated in Philadelphia's Center City district from 1898 until 1923. The family depicted appeared prosperous, though not wealthy. The father wore a 3-piece suit of quality wool, his watch chain visible across his vest. The mother sat in the center, her dress adorned with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. 2 daughters flanked her sides, perhaps 8 and 10 years old, wearing matching white pinafores over dark dresses. A teenage boy stood behind them, his hand resting protectively on his mother's shoulder. Sarah positioned the photograph on the scanner bed, adjusting the corners to ensure perfect alignment. The device hummed as light passed beneath the glass, capturing every detail in high resolution. When the image appeared on her computer screen, magnified to 3 times its original size, Sarah noticed something peculiar. The mother's right hand rested in her lap, fingers curled around something concealed within her glove. Not merely holding it, gripping it with unmistakable tension. She zoomed in further. The glove itself was unusual. While gloves were common accessories in 1915, particularly for formal occasions, these extended unusually high on the forearm, nearly to the elbow. They appeared to be kidskin leather, expensive and well-fitted, yet something about their placement seemed deliberate beyond mere fashion. The fabric pulled tight across the knuckles, where the mother's fingers clenched around the hidden object. Sarah leaned closer to the monitor, adjusting the contrast and brightness. The family's faces showed typical photographic solemnity, the expression people naturally adopted when posing for formal portraits in that era. But now, studying the mother's features with greater attention, Sarah detected something else, a tightness around the eyes, a barely perceptible tension in the jaw. This woman was not merely posing, she was enduring. The children's expressions suddenly took on new meaning. The younger daughter's gaze didn't face the camera directly, but angled slightly toward her mother, as if monitoring, watching, waiting. The boy's hand on his mother's shoulder appeared less protective than restraining. His fingers pressed with noticeable pressure into the fabric of her dress. Even the older daughter, positioned at the periphery, seemed coiled with awareness. Her body angled inward toward the family's center where her mother sat. Sarah saved the image and opened her database of historical records. Hartwell & Sons had maintained meticulous business ledgers, many of which survived in the Society's collections. If this family had been photographed there in 1915, there might be an appointment record, perhaps even names. She began searching through digitized ledger pages, looking for entries from that year. The studio had been busy, photographing dozens of families each month. Finding one specific appointment would require patience and methodical attention, but something about this photograph wouldn't release its hold on her thoughts. That glove, that grip, that barely concealed tension radiating from every member of the family. Sarah had examined thousands of historical photographs during her career. She had developed an instinct for recognizing when an image contained more than it initially revealed. This portrait was hiding something, and whatever the mother clutched within that glove might be the key to understanding what. The Hartwell & Sons ledgers revealed their secrets slowly, requiring Sarah to cross-reference multiple sources before patterns emerged. The studio's appointment book for April 1915 listed 37 family portraits scheduled that month. Most entries included only surnames and appointment times, but occasionally the clerk had added notes, requesters multiple copies, or special backdrop requested, or payment arrangement required. On April 18, 1915, a single entry caught Sarah's attention. Blackwood family. 2:30 p.m. Portrait sitting. Prepaid full amount. Special request. Minimal processing time. The prepayment detail was significant. Most families of modest means paid for portraits in installments, settling the bill when they collected the finished photographs. Full advance payment suggested either substantial financial resources or unusual urgency. The request for minimal processing time reinforced the latter interpretation. Someone in the Blackwood family wanted these photographs quickly. Sarah expanded her search to Philadelphia city directories from 1915. She found 3 Blackwood families listed in the metropolitan area that year. The first, residing on Spruce Street in a fashionable neighborhood, consisted of elderly parents and their unmarried daughter, demographics that didn't match the portrait's composition. The second family lived in a boarding house in the industrial district, their listing indicating the father worked as a factory laborer. Possible, but the clothing and bearing of the family in the photograph suggested a higher economic station. The third entry proved more promising. Blackwood, Thomas R., pharmacist, res. under 847 Cypress Avenue. The address placed them in a respectable middle-class neighborhood, precisely the demographic that the portrait suggested. Pharmacists occupied a notable social position in early 20th century America. Respected professionals who required scientific training and maintained community trust. The income would support the quality of clothing visible in the photograph. Sarah requested the personnel files from the Philadelphia College of Pharmacy, hoping to find additional information about Thomas Blackwood. The archive delivered a slim folder containing his enrollment records from 1895, his graduation certificate from 1897, and his state licensure documentation. A notation in his file indicated he had opened his own pharmacy in 1902, operating it successfully until 1918, when the business was sold, under circumstances the records didn't specify. But the file contained one additional document that made Sarah's pulse quicken. A newspaper clipping from the Philadelphia Inquirer dated May 3, 1915, exactly 2 weeks after the Blackwood family's portrait sitting. The headline read, "Local pharmacist's wife hospitalized following domestic incident." The article was brief, occupying barely 3 column inches on page 7, the sort of minor local news that merited only cursory coverage. Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood, wife of pharmacist Thomas R. Blackwood, was admitted to Pennsylvania Hospital on Tuesday evening, following what neighbors described as a domestic disturbance at the family's Cypress Avenue residence. Hospital officials declined to comment on Mrs. Blackwood's condition. Mr. Blackwood could not be reached for statement. Sarah read the clipping 3 times, her mind racing through implications. A family portrait taken on April 18th. A hospitalization 2 weeks later, following a domestic disturbance. And in that portrait, a mother gripping something within her glove with unmistakable tension, while her family surrounded her with expressions that now seemed less like formal posing and more like watchful containment. She needed to see the original photograph again, not merely the digital scan, but the physical artifact itself. Sometimes the back of a photograph contained notations, inscriptions or photographer's marks, that revealed information the image alone couldn't provide. Sarah retrieved the portrait from the archive storage and carefully turned it over. The backing paper had yellowed and grown brittle with age, but someone had written across it in faded ink. The handwriting was careful, deliberate. Each letter formed with precision. The last photograph, April 18, 1915, before everything changed, E.B. The initials matched. Eleanor Blackwood. The mother in the portrait had written these words herself, presumably after the photograph was developed and returned to the family. But the phrasing struck Sarah as deeply ominous. The last photograph suggested finality, an ending rather than a beginning. Before everything changed implied a threshold, a moment when circumstances shifted irrevocably. And Eleanor had felt compelled to document that moment, to mark this photograph as evidence of something significant. Sarah examined the image once more, focusing specifically on Eleanor's face. The woman staring back at her through a century of distance suddenly seemed less like a historical curiosity, and more like someone trying desperately to communicate across time, leaving clues for whoever might eventually understand enough to look. Whatever Eleanor Blackwood clutched within that glove, she had needed it during that portrait sitting, needed it badly enough to grip it throughout the lengthy exposure, badly enough that its presence was detectable even through leather and across decades. Sarah was determined to discover what it was and why it mattered. Pennsylvania Hospital's admission records from 1915 were incomplete, many having been destroyed in a fire during the 1950s, but patient registries survived in microfilm format. Sarah spent 2 days reviewing entries from late April and early May of that year, searching for Eleanor Blackwood's name. She found it on April 30th, 12 days after the portrait sitting. The registry entry was clinical, stripped of narrative detail. Eleanor Blackwood, age 37, admitted April 30th, 1915, 8:47 p.m. Attending physician, Dr. Harold Williamson. Diagnosis: contusions, lacerations, suspected fractured ribs. Discharged May 14, 1915. 2 weeks of hospitalization for injuries consistent with assault. Sarah's suspicions were crystallizing into certainty. Whatever had been happening in the Blackwood household, Eleanor had known it was escalating. That portrait sitting hadn't been about preserving a happy family memory. It had been about creating evidence, documentation, a record of a specific moment in time before circumstances deteriorated further. But Sarah still couldn't identify what Eleanor held within that glove. The object's outline was barely visible through the leather, suggesting something small, perhaps cylindrical. She enhanced the digital image further, adjusting contrast and sharpness until the pixels began to fragment. The shape remained frustratingly ambiguous. She needed a different approach. Sarah contacted Dr. Marcus Chen, a colleague who specialized in photographic analysis and historical imaging technologies. Marcus had access to specialized equipment capable of revealing details invisible to conventional examination. Within an hour, he arrived at the Historical Society with a portable multispectral imaging system. "You think there's something hidden in the photograph itself?" Marcus asked, setting up his equipment around the portrait. "Not hidden in the photograph," Sarah clarified. "Hidden in the glove. The mother is holding something and I need to know what it is." Marcus positioned specialized lights at precise angles around the portrait, then activated his imaging system. The equipment captured the photograph under multiple wavelengths of light, from ultraviolet through visible spectrum into infrared. Each wavelength revealed different information, penetrating materials to different depths, exposing details that ordinary light concealed. The images appeared on Marcus's laptop screen one wavelength at a time. Ultraviolet revealed the photograph's chemical composition, showing areas where the original emulsion had degraded. Visible light produced an image similar to what Sarah had already examined. But when Marcus switched to near-infrared imaging, the screen displayed something extraordinary. The leather glove became partially transparent under infrared light, its opacity reduced enough to reveal the object concealed within. The shape was now unmistakable, a small glass vial, approximately 3 inches long, gripped vertically in Eleanor's right hand. The vial appeared to contain liquid, visible as a darker region within the transparent container. "That's a medicine bottle," Marcus said immediately. "Typical pharmaceutical packaging from that era. You can see the glass is thicker at the base, the way they manufactured them then." Sarah felt pieces of understanding begin to align. Eleanor Blackwood, married to a pharmacist. Eleanor Blackwood, hospitalized with injuries from domestic violence 2 weeks after this portrait. Eleanor Blackwood, holding a medicine vial concealed in her glove during a formal family photograph. "Can you determine what might be inside?" Sarah asked. Marcus shook his head. "Not from a photograph, even with this technology, but given the context you've described, and the fact that she felt it necessary to conceal it during a portrait sitting, I'd suggest it was something significant, something that constituted evidence or perhaps protection." Sarah understood immediately. In 1915, pharmacists had access to substances that would later become strictly controlled: laudanum, morphine, cocaine solutions, arsenic compounds. All were commercially available and legally sold for various medicinal purposes. A pharmacist could easily obtain any of them without documentation or oversight. Eleanor had taken something from her husband's pharmacy, something she considered important enough to keep with her constantly, even during a formal portrait sitting when she knew she would be photographed. She had concealed it within her glove, but not so completely that its presence was entirely undetectable. Perhaps she had wanted it findable, eventually, by someone who knew how to look. The newspaper clipping had mentioned a domestic disturbance. The hospital records documented serious injuries, and now this photograph revealed Eleanor carrying concealed evidence during what her own inscription described as the last photograph before everything changed. Sarah needed to find out what happened next. Hospital records showed Eleanor was discharged on May 14, 1915. But the trail ended there. She returned to city directories, this time examining subsequent years. The 1916 directory listed Thomas R. Blackwood, still at the Cypress Avenue address, still operating as a pharmacist. But Eleanor's name no longer appeared alongside his. The 1917 directory showed the same pattern. Thomas remained at the address, but the listing no longer mentioned a wife. By 1918, the directory indicated the pharmacy had been sold, and Thomas Blackwood no longer appeared in Philadelphia records. Eleanor Blackwood had vanished from documentation after her hospital discharge in May 1915. No death certificate existed in Philadelphia records for that year or the next. No divorce filing appeared in court archives. She had simply disappeared from the official record, as if she had never existed at all. The absence of records was itself a kind of evidence, Sarah realized. Women who disappeared from official documentation in early 20th century America usually did so for specific reasons: death, institutionalization, or deliberate escape to begin new lives elsewhere under different names. Eleanor Blackwood's inscription on the photograph suggested she had anticipated significant change, but whether that change had been voluntary or forced remained unclear. Sarah expanded her search beyond Philadelphia, examining records from surrounding counties and neighboring states. Women fleeing domestic violence in that era often sought refuge with relatives or in communities far enough from home that their husbands couldn't easily locate them. She searched for Eleanor Blackwood in New York, New Jersey, Delaware, and Maryland, checking city directories, census records, and property transfers. For 3 weeks, the search yielded nothing. Then Sarah discovered a marriage record from Wilmington, Delaware, dated June 30, 1915, barely 6 weeks after Eleanor's hospital discharge. The bride's name was listed as Eleanor Brennan, age 37, previously married, no current address listed. The groom was Charles Morrison, a railway conductor, age 42, resident of Wilmington. Brennan had been Eleanor's maiden name, documented in the pharmacy college records, alongside Thomas Blackwood's enrollment information. A woman matching Eleanor's age, marrying in a nearby city shortly after disappearing from Philadelphia records, using her maiden name. The circumstantial evidence was compelling, though not conclusive. Sarah requested additional documentation from Delaware archives. The marriage certificate arrived via email 3 days later, and attached to it was a supporting document that Eleanor had been required to provide, evidence that her previous marriage had legally ended. The certificate showed a divorce decree dated May 20, 1915, granted by the Philadelphia County Court on grounds of extreme cruelty, petitioner Eleanor Blackwood, respondent Thomas R. Blackwood. 6 days after her discharge from the hospital, Eleanor had filed for divorce. The proceedings had moved with unusual speed, suggesting either compelling evidence or influential legal assistance. By the end of May, she was legally free. By the end of June, she had remarried and relocated to another state, placing distance and a new identity between herself and the life documented in that April portrait. But the question of the vial remained. What had Eleanor carried in her glove that day at Hartwell & Sons photography studio? Sarah found the answer in an unexpected location, a supplementary filing attached to the divorce proceedings, a document she discovered while reviewing the complete court archive. The filing was a sworn affidavit from Dr. Harold Williamson, the physician who had treated Eleanor at Pennsylvania Hospital. In careful medical terminology, Dr. Williamson described his patient's injuries and his professional opinion regarding their origin. Then he added a detail that transformed Sarah's understanding of the entire situation. During her hospitalization, Mrs. Blackwood provided me with a glass vial containing a substance she represented as having taken from her husband's pharmacy. At her request, I arranged for chemical analysis of this substance by a qualified pharmacist unaffiliated with Mr. Blackwood. The analysis revealed the vial contained a concentrated arsenic solution, specifically Fowler's solution, a legitimate pharmaceutical preparation when properly used, but potentially fatal in excessive doses. Mrs. Blackwood reported finding multiple such vials concealed in locations throughout their residence, and she expressed credible fear that her husband intended to poison her gradually, disguising murder as natural illness. Sarah sat back from the computer screen, the full picture finally visible. The portrait sitting on April 18th hadn't merely documented a troubled family. It had preserved evidence at a moment when Eleanor Blackwood was preparing to escape a husband who was attempting to murder her. She had discovered his arsenic stores and taken a sample, carrying it constantly as both evidence and protection. During the portrait sitting, she had concealed it in her glove, but deliberately, in a way that left traces detectable to careful observers. The family's expressions in the portrait now made complete sense. Thomas Blackwood stood behind his wife, his presence looming authoritative. The children surrounded Eleanor, positioned as if forming a barrier, perhaps complicit in protecting their mother, or perhaps monitoring her on their father's behalf. Eleanor herself sat at the center, gripping evidence that would ultimately save her life, her face reflecting the terrible knowledge that she was living with someone actively working to end her existence. The inscription on the photograph's back, the last photograph, before everything changed, carried new meaning now. Eleanor had been preparing her escape, documenting the family as it existed before she revealed what she knew and set in motion the events that would free her. The portrait was evidence, testimony, and farewell all at once. Sarah carefully documented her findings, preparing a comprehensive report for the Historical Society's archives. The portrait would remain in the collection, but now it would carry a complete provenance, explaining not just who appeared in the image, but what the photograph represented. A moment of extraordinary courage, frozen in time, preserved for more than a century, until someone finally understood how to interpret its meaning. Sarah's discovery transformed how the Historical Society presented the Blackwood family portrait. What had been catalogued as merely unidentified family circa 1915 now carried comprehensive documentation explaining Eleanor's courage and the photograph's true significance. But Sarah's investigation didn't end with solving the mystery of the glove. She needed to know what had become of Eleanor Blackwood Morrison in the years following her escape. Delaware census records from 1920 showed Eleanor living in Wilmington with Charles Morrison and 2 children, a boy and a girl, ages 3 and 4. The children's birth certificates listed Eleanor Morrison as the mother, Charles Morrison as the father. Eleanor had built a new life, one that apparently included the family she had perhaps always wanted, but had been denied in her first marriage. The Blackwood children from the 1915 portrait proved more difficult to trace. Sarah found records indicating that the teenage boy, identified as Robert Blackwood, had enlisted in the army in 1917 when America entered the First World War. He had served in France with the American Expeditionary Forces and had been killed at Château-Thierry in June 1918, 3 years after that portrait was taken. The military records listed his next of kin as his father, Thomas R. Blackwood, with no mention of Eleanor. The 2 daughters appeared in Philadelphia school records through 1916, then disappeared from local documentation. Sarah eventually found them in Baltimore, Maryland, living with a maternal aunt, whose name appeared in Eleanor's divorce petition as a witness. The girls had been removed from their father's household, presumably by court order or family arrangement, and had been raised by Eleanor's sister. Both had married in the 1920s and had established lives far from Philadelphia. Thomas Blackwood's trajectory after the divorce followed a predictable pattern of decline. The 1918 city directory showed he had sold his pharmacy, and subsequent records placed him in a series of boarding houses in increasingly marginal neighborhoods. He appeared in a 1920 arrest record for public intoxication. By 1923, he was listed as residing at the Philadelphia Almshouse, a municipal institution for indigent residents. He died there in 1925, at age 53, the death certificate listing cirrhosis of the liver as the cause. The contrast between Eleanor's trajectory and Thomas's could hardly have been more stark. Eleanor had escaped, rebuilt her life, and apparently found happiness in her second marriage. Thomas had lost everything: his business, his family, his social standing, his health. Whether his decline stemmed from guilt, alcoholism, or simply the consequences of his actions remained unclear, but the outcome was undeniable. Sarah discovered one additional document that provided insight into Eleanor's emotional state in the years following her divorce. In 1922, Eleanor had written a letter to the Pennsylvania hospital requesting copies of her medical records from her 1915 hospitalization. The hospital's response, preserved in their archives, included a brief cover letter explaining that they were providing the requested documentation. But attached to the response was Eleanor's original request, and its contents revealed her motivation. "I am writing to request copies of my medical records from my admission in April 1915, Eleanor had written in clear, precise handwriting. "I have 2 young children now, and I want them to understand, when they are old enough, what their mother survived before they were born. I want them to know that circumstances, no matter how difficult, can be overcome. I want them to have documentation of the truth, not just stories." The letter revealed Eleanor's desire to transform her trauma into a teaching moment for her children. She had survived an attempted murder, had gathered evidence, had pursued legal remedy, and had escaped to build a new life. She wanted her children to have proof that their mother had possessed the courage to save herself. When doing so required confronting social stigma, legal barriers, and personal danger. Sarah included a transcription of Eleanor's letter in the exhibition documentation that would accompany the portrait's display. The photograph would no longer hang anonymously on a gallery wall. Visitors would learn Eleanor's name, her story, her courage. They would understand that the woman in the portrait, gripping something within her glove, had been holding evidence that would save her life. The exhibition opened in November 2019, and the response exceeded Sarah's expectations. News coverage of Eleanor's story generated regional and then national attention. Survivors of domestic violence contacted the Historical Society to share their own experiences and to express gratitude that Eleanor's courage was being recognized and honored more than a century later. One visitor in particular caught Sarah's attention. An elderly woman arrived at the Society one afternoon in December, requesting to see the Blackwood portrait. She stood before the photograph for nearly 20 minutes, studying Eleanor's face with intense concentration. Finally, she turned to Sarah. "My grandmother's name was Eleanor Morrison," the woman said quietly. "She died when I was very young, but my mother always said Grandma Eleanor had been the bravest woman she ever knew. I never understood why until today." The woman's name was Catherine Reynolds, and she had traveled from Baltimore specifically to see the portrait after reading about Sarah's discovery in a newspaper article. She carried with her a worn leather photograph album that had belonged to her grandmother Eleanor, and she asked if Sarah might be willing to examine its contents. They sat together in the Society's research room, and Catherine carefully opened the album. The first photograph showed a woman in her 40s standing with 2 young children in front of a modest house. The woman was older than in the 1915 portrait, her face marked by experience, but unmistakably the same person. Eleanor Morrison, photographed circa 1925, with the children she had mentioned in her letter to Pennsylvania Hospital. "My mother is the little girl in this picture," Catherine explained, pointing to a child of perhaps 5 years old. "She told me that Grandma Eleanor never spoke much about her life before marrying my grandfather Charles, but she did tell my mother one thing repeatedly, that women must never accept abuse as their fate, that they always have the right to save themselves, no matter what society expects them to endure." The album contained dozens of photographs documenting Eleanor's life in Wilmington, birthday celebrations, holiday gatherings, ordinary moments of family life, all the visual evidence of a woman who had successfully escaped tragedy and built something better. But near the end of the album, Catherine turned to a page that made Sarah's breath catch. It was the Blackwood family portrait from 1915, the same image Sarah had discovered in the Historical Society's archives. But this copy had been altered. Someone had carefully cut out Thomas Blackwood's figure, removing him entirely from the photograph. The children remained, Eleanor remained, but the man who had tried to murder her had been excised, leaving only a blank space where he had stood. "My mother said Grandma Eleanor kept this photograph as a reminder," Catherine said, "not of what she had endured, but of what she had overcome. She cut out my grandfather Thomas because she said he no longer deserved to exist in her memory or in the record she would leave for her family. She wanted us to remember the woman who had saved herself and her daughters, not the man who had tried to destroy her." The modification to the photograph was itself an act of reclamation, Sarah realized. Eleanor had taken an image that documented one of the worst periods of her life and had transformed it into a testament to survival. By removing Thomas from the picture, she had asserted control over her own narrative, refusing to allow his presence to dominate her history. Catherine reached into her purse and withdrew a small object wrapped in tissue paper. "My mother left this to me with instructions to donate it to a museum or historical society if I ever discovered that Grandma Eleanor's story was being told publicly. She said it was important evidence that shouldn't remain hidden in a family's private possession." She unwrapped the tissue paper to reveal a small glass vial, approximately 3 inches long, with a cork stopper sealed with wax. A faded label adhered to the glass read Fowler's Solution in handwritten script. The vial was empty, but its historical significance was immeasurable. This was the actual evidence Eleanor had carried in her glove during that 1915 portrait sitting, the arsenic sample she had used to prove her husband's murderous intent. "She kept it all these years?" Sarah asked, handling the vial with appropriate reverence. Catherine nodded. "My mother said Grandma Eleanor called it her freedom bottle. She kept it as a reminder that evidence and courage could overcome even the most dangerous circumstances. She wanted her descendants to have it, to remember that we come from a woman who refused to be a victim." Sarah accepted the donation with gratitude, understanding that the vial would become the centerpiece of the exhibition. The photograph showed Eleanor holding the evidence. Now visitors could see the actual object, could understand its weight, its significance, its role in saving a woman's life. Catherine shared additional family history during their conversation. Eleanor had lived until 1952, dying at age 74 after a long and apparently happy marriage to Charles Morrison. She had remained in Wilmington her entire life after leaving Philadelphia, had been active in women's organizations and charitable work, and had been particularly involved with groups supporting women escaping domestic violence. She never forgot where she came from or what she survived, Catherine said. "My mother told me that Grandma Eleanor believed her escape had been possible because she had access to resources many women lacked: education, some financial means, supportive family members. She felt obligated to help other women who faced similar dangers, but without the same advantages." The 2 daughters from Eleanor's first marriage had maintained contact with their mother throughout their lives, Catherine revealed. The relationships had been complicated by the circumstances of the divorce and the girls' removal from their father's household, but Eleanor had worked to rebuild connections with them. Both daughters had attended Eleanor's funeral in 1952, and family photographs from later years showed them together with their half-siblings from Eleanor's second marriage. Sarah asked about the teenage boy from the portrait, Robert Blackwood, who had died in France during World War I. Catherine's expression grew somber. "My mother said Grandma Eleanor grieved terribly for Robert. He had enlisted before she could reconnect with him after the divorce, and he died without them ever reconciling. She kept his military death notification until her own death, and she always maintained that one of her greatest regrets was not finding a way to reach him before he went to war." The expanded exhibition opened in March 2020, incorporating Catherine Reynolds' donated vial and additional photographs from Eleanor's later life. The presentation now told a complete story, from the cryptic 1915 portrait through Eleanor's escape, survival, and eventual triumph over the circumstances that had nearly destroyed her. Sarah had worked closely with domestic violence advocacy organizations to ensure the exhibition's narrative emphasized not just historical curiosity, but contemporary relevance. The interpretive text accompanying the display addressed issues that remained urgent more than a century after Eleanor's ordeal. Statistics about intimate partner violence, information about resources for survivors, historical context about women's limited legal rights in 1915, all of these elements combined to transform the exhibition from a simple historical presentation into an educational tool that connected past and present. One section of the exhibition explored the specific challenge Eleanor had faced regarding proof and evidence. In 1915, women seeking divorce on grounds of cruelty faced significant legal obstacles. They needed to provide compelling evidence of abuse, but such evidence was often difficult to obtain. Domestic violence occurred in private spaces, away from witnesses. Victims who reported abuse to authorities frequently encountered skepticism or dismissal, particularly when accusations were directed at respectable, established community members like pharmacists or businessmen. Eleanor's discovery of the arsenic vials had given her irrefutable evidence of her husband's intent. Poison was tangible, testable, provable. The chemical analysis Dr. Williamson had arranged had transformed Eleanor's accusations from mere testimony into scientific fact. This evidence, combined with her documented injuries from hospitalization, had created a legal case strong enough to overcome the considerable barriers women faced in divorce proceedings during that era. Sarah's research had also uncovered information about Dr. Harold Williamson, the physician who had treated Eleanor and facilitated the chemical analysis of the arsenic sample. Williamson had been a progressive reformer who advocated for women's health and safety. He had published articles in medical journals arguing that physicians had an ethical obligation to assist women seeking to escape dangerous domestic situations. His involvement in Eleanor's case had been consistent with his publicly stated principles. The exhibition included excerpts from Williamson's writings, including a particularly relevant passage from a 1916 article titled "The Physician's Role in Protecting Vulnerable Patients." He had written, "When a patient arrives with injuries consistent with assault, and when that patient expresses credible fear for her safety, the physician's duty extends beyond treating physical wounds. We must be willing to document evidence, to provide testimony, and to assist patients in accessing legal protections. Neutrality in such circumstances is not professionalism, it is complicity." Williamson's words resonated with contemporary medical ethics training, which emphasized the importance of screening for intimate partner violence and assisting victims in accessing resources. Sarah worked with local medical schools to bring students to the exhibition as part of their ethics curriculum, using Eleanor's story as a case study in physician responsibility and patient advocacy. The exhibition also examined Thomas Blackwood's trajectory with appropriate analytical distance. Sarah had consulted with psychologists and historians, specializing in the study of domestic violence perpetrators, to understand the patterns his behavior exemplified. The attempt to poison Eleanor represented an extreme form of intimate partner violence, one that combined premeditation, access to means, and a calculated effort to disguise murder as natural death. The fact that Thomas had been a pharmacist with legitimate access to arsenic compounds made his actions particularly chilling. He had exploited professional knowledge and resources to attempt murder, demonstrating how positions of community trust and respectability could mask dangerous behavior. His subsequent decline after Eleanor's escape followed patterns documented in research about abusers who lose control over their victims. The loss of the relationship often precipitates broader social and personal deterioration. But the exhibition's primary focus remained on Eleanor's courage and agency. Sarah had deliberately structured the narrative to emphasize Eleanor's active role in saving herself, rather than portraying her primarily as a victim. Eleanor had investigated, discovered evidence, preserved it, carried it with her constantly, sought medical care, engaged legal representation, pursued divorce, and rebuilt her life. Each of these actions required courage, intelligence, and determination. The 1915 portrait served as the exhibition's visual anchor, but it was now surrounded by context that transformed its meaning. Visitors understood that the woman gripping something within her glove was not posing passively, but was actively engaged in the process of saving her own life. The photograph documented not victimhood, but resistance. Not helplessness, but strategic planning. Catherine Reynolds visited the exhibition multiple times, often bringing family members who wanted to see their ancestors' story presented publicly. She told Sarah that the experience had been simultaneously difficult and cathartic for the family. Difficult because it required confronting traumatic history, but cathartic because it honored Eleanor's courage and ensured her story would not be forgotten. For generations, this was family secret, Catherine explained during one visit. We knew parts of it, but the full story remained fragmented, incomplete. Seeing everything documented here, seeing Grandma Eleanor's courage recognized publicly, it changes how we understand our own family history. We're not descended from a victim. We're descended from a survivor who fought back and won. Sarah understood that sentiment reflected broader cultural shifts in how society discussed domestic violence. Terminology had evolved from emphasizing victimhood to recognizing survivorship, from treating abuse as private family matter to acknowledging it as serious crime requiring legal intervention and social support. The exhibition remained on display for 18 months, far longer than originally planned, due to sustained public interest and its adoption by advocacy organizations as an educational resource. During that time, more than 50,000 visitors viewed Eleanor Blackwood's portrait and learned her story. The guest book filled with comments from people who found meaning and inspiration in Eleanor's courage, including many who shared their own experiences of surviving dangerous relationships. One visitor left a comment that particularly moved Sarah. "I came here thinking I was looking at history. I left understanding I was looking at a mirror. Thank you for telling Eleanor's story. It helped me find courage to tell my own." In October 2021, the Historical Society hosted a symposium examining the broader historical context of Eleanor's experience. Scholars presented research on domestic violence in early 20th century America, women's legal rights during that period, the role of medical professionals in documenting abuse, and the evolution of social and legal responses to intimate partner violence over the past century. Catherine Reynolds participated in a panel discussion about family history and the importance of preserving difficult stories rather than allowing them to disappear into silence. During the symposium, a researcher from Drexel University presented findings from a study examining divorce records from Philadelphia between 1900 and 1920. The research revealed that Eleanor's case, while exceptional in its documentation and preservation, was not unique in its basic circumstances. Dozens of women had sought divorces citing extreme cruelty during those years, and court records showed patterns of abuse that included physical violence, economic control, and in several cases suspected poisoning. What had made Eleanor's case distinctive was not the abuse itself, but the quality of evidence she had managed to preserve and the fact that her story had survived in such complete form. Most women who escaped dangerous marriages left little trace in historical records beyond basic legal documents. Their stories, their courage, their strategies for survival remained largely undocumented and therefore unknown to subsequent generations. Sarah reflected on this reality as the symposium concluded. How many other photographs in archives and museums around the world contained hidden stories of survival? How many other images showed women holding concealed evidence, making silent pleas for help, documenting moments of crisis in ways that would only become visible when examined with proper attention and technology? The Blackwood portrait had been preserved by chance, donated to the Historical Society as part of an estate acquisition, catalogued but not deeply investigated for decades, then scanned with high-resolution equipment that revealed details invisible to casual observation. How many other photographs had been discarded, lost or destroyed before anyone understood what they documented? These questions motivated Sarah to develop a broader initiative focused on examining photographic collections for evidence of hidden histories. She secured a grant to fund systematic high-resolution digitization and multispectral imaging of the Historical Society's entire collection of early 20th century family portraits. The project would take years to complete, But she was convinced it would reveal additional stories that deserved to be told. The Blackwood portrait itself was eventually accessioned into the Society's permanent collection, where it would remain available for future research and exhibition. The arsenic vial Catherine had donated was preserved in climate-controlled storage, its chain of custody carefully documented to maintain its evidentiary integrity for historians and researchers. Eleanor's story found unexpected reach beyond the museum context. A documentary filmmaker contacted Sarah about developing a short film based on the portrait and Eleanor's survival. A playwright proposed adapting the story for the stage. Multiple authors requested permission to incorporate Eleanor's experience into books about women's history, domestic violence, and the social changes of the early 20th century. Sarah approved these requests carefully, working to ensure that Eleanor's story was told accurately and respectfully, that it honored her courage without sensationalizing her trauma, and that it served educational purposes rather than mere entertainment. She established guidelines requiring that any adaptation include information about contemporary resources for domestic violence survivors, and that Eleanor be portrayed as an active agent in her own rescue rather than as a passive victim. In early 2023, Catherine Reynolds contacted Sarah with news that shifted the story's meaning one final time. Catherine had been researching her family genealogy and had discovered that Eleanor's great-great-granddaughter, Catherine's own grandniece, was currently working as the director of a domestic violence shelter in Pennsylvania. The young woman had chosen her career path without knowing the complete details of Eleanor's story, but Catherine believed the family history had influenced her on some unconscious level. Eleanor's courage echoes through generations, Catherine told Sarah. She saved herself in 1915, and somehow that act of survival created ripples that are still reaching forward in time, still inspiring women in our family to fight for safety and dignity. Sarah understood that this was ultimately what gave historical work its deepest meaning. The past was not merely something to study and preserve, it was a living force that shaped present and future. Eleanor Blackwood's decision to gather evidence, to carry that vial of arsenic in her glove during a portrait sitting, to pursue legal remedy and escape to a new life, had created consequences that extended far beyond her own survival. Her descendants carried forward her courage. Her story educated thousands of museum visitors. Her example provided hope to people facing similar dangers more than a century later. The photograph that had once been anonymous and unexplained had become a powerful testament to human resilience, strategic resistance, and the possibility of survival even in the most dangerous circumstances. The portrait still hangs in the Historical Society's gallery, Eleanor's face looking out across time, her gloved hand still gripping the evidence that saved her life. And now, finally, everyone who sees it knows what they are witnessing. Not just a family photograph from 1915, but a moment of extraordinary courage preserved forever in silver and light. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.